for that thing that was not my fault. Okay, so I just want to say again how much I've appreciated this. I really have just loved the opportunity to be able to speak on this issue, and I hope that it is edifying, and that you're getting a good bit out of this. So again, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. Just to refresh a little bit, kind of where we stopped last week. Last week was a different style. And I think just to wrap up a little bit of that, a summary I think I might say is we're dealing with trauma. We're dealing with historical trauma. People experience trauma individually. Groups can experience trauma if they've been through horrible things like a refugee experience or a genocide, and it's the healing of that trauma that I'm interested in talking about. And the takeaway from that article that I shared last week, I think maybe a way of summing it up would be to say I'm hopefully enough of a touchy-feely person to know that I'm not just a pure analytic or something like that, that you need to kind of sugarcoat some bad news or massage things, be diplomatic, be politic, all that kind of stuff. To use a kind of medical metaphor, maybe it would be good to say this is the difference between a doctor with different bedside manners. And a bedside manner it might not necessarily affect the outcome of the treatment, but just a doctor just showing up and being robotic and saying, here's what the problem is, here's what your chances are, here's the way forward, yada, yada. That's not always going to help in this situation. So I feel like, I hope that analogy works, that in addition to knowing the material, there has to be a very careful, delicate balancing act in the way that stories are told, in the way that accusations are made, in the way that moral judgments are made. So I just wanted to bring some kind of summary and conclusion to last week's talk. So I wanted to bring it up to 1955, and a convenient way, this is the way I lecture on it, just to kind of have these stories in your head. People talk about the civil rights movement. And so when did it happen? What are its boundaries? And we think in decades, we think in terms of the 50s, the 60s, 70s, that kind of thing, when we think about the 20th century. The civil rights movement it was basically 10 years from 1955 to 1965. So that's a nice, simple way to remember it. One thing that a question that historians often ask is, why did something happen now? Or why did something happen when it did? You can talk about kind of the metaphor of a campfire is often used. You have the kindling, you have the oxygenated air, and then you need a spark to kind of get it all going. The kindling and the oxygenated air can kind of be there forever, but if you don't have a spark, nothing's going to combust. So you need something to kind of kick it off. Why did the civil rights movement start in 1955? What I tell students, it's a very traditional lecture, and I'm going to summarize it here. One issue is World War II, that Black soldiers went off to fight Nazism and the Japanese Empire, were treated relatively as equals as soldiers, or at least their suffering and death was equal to white soldiers. And then coming back, so fighting for the American nation, and then coming back and being treated as secondhand citizens. And there's just a kind of that we can't do this anymore. We can't take this anymore. Also, very significant was the development of the television. I think that was really the game changer in terms of basically bringing the violence of racism into people's homes, so people could see it and not just hear about it. One thing that I say to students is the NAACP used to hang a banner outside its office that said, "A Black man was lynched yesterday. A Black man was lynched in the South yesterday." They they made one banner and they flew that banner every time it happened. That's as far as the word got. People walking along the street and seeing that banner, and word of mouth basically after that, maybe some newspaper stories, probably in black newspapers. The television shines a light on that violence. And so people could see it and feel it and experience it exactly in the same way that we did when we watched George Floyd's death, and exactly in the same way we did when we watched the beating of Rodney King, or other things that we've seen on television in the last however many years. It has a more powerful emotional impact when you see it than when you just hear about it. And the last thing that kind of led up to the civil rights movement was the Cold War, or what was an important context was the Cold War, because now the United States was the kind of standard bearer for democracy and capitalism, and the way minorities are treated in the United States is bad press, to put it mildly. It's the worst thing that the United States was engaging in, that communists made very good propaganda out of. In Birmingham, Alabama, where I'm from, when there were the fire hoses and the dogs, that made the front pages of newspapers in China the next day. They were very keen on. So why this matters is people in power, presidents, were embarrassed about this. John F. Kennedy in particular. So just want to kind of set up why the civil rights movement happened when it did. Another thing, which is horrible and literally grotesque, in 1955 was the shooting of Emmett Till. This, I believe he was a teenager, might have even been younger than that, black young man, maybe you can even say black boy, who went from Chicago down to Mississippi. He supposedly whistled at a white woman, and a few days later he's dead, and he's gone. They find his body in a river. I don't know if y'all know this story, but Emmett Till's mother insisted on giving him an open casket funeral. So everyone filing past the casket could see what happened to his face. And in the documentary Eyes on the Prize, they show it. You might want to be careful if you ever want to look this up on the internet, because it might show it. His face looks like hamburger. It's not a face anymore. But she insisted on an open casket, and you see people filing past his casket and just fainting and screaming and wailing. It's just, and that happened in 1955, in the summer of 1955. That was a major trigger for this. In 1954 was Brown versus Board of Education, which was also a major momentum accelerator. But the story, in my opinion, really does begin with, in terms of the movement, it really does begin with Rosa Parks and the bus boycott in Montgomery and not giving up her seat. I think that there's true heroism there. There's other things that I can tell you about that story. I don't know if you know this, but Martin Luther King, a recently ordained minister, with a PhD, he was still finishing his PhD from Boston University, I think, finishing his dissertation, when he took this church in Montgomery. It just so happens that he took this church in Montgomery, Alabama. And I'm forgetting exactly the sequence of this, but just months later, the Rosa Parks incident happens. And in Montgomery, the leaders in the African-American community in Montgomery, okay, we have something going on here. This is big. Rosa Parks was arrested, and the Black community is not going to take it anymore. We're going to boycott. They handed the organization of the boycott over to MLK. And the reason why they did that is because within their own community in Montgomery, there were, big surprise, their egos. And so like, well, we don't want to give leadership to this guy or that because it'll alienate another church. So give it to the new guy. They just dumped it in the lap of the new guy. And this is where Martin Luther King, who was immensely talented and I would say a bona fide genius, jumped into the organizational challenges that were involved in this and led masterfully, absolutely masterfully in this. And the bus boycott ended in Supreme Court desegregating buses. So this was, and why this mattered, about 11 months later, they were boycotting these buses with this tremendous, unbelievable logistical challenges to get people around from the black part of town to the white part of town where a lot of these people worked. It was really very sacrificial and unbelievably difficult to organize, and they did it. And it resulted in a victory. So this victory then propelled even more momentum. After this, Martin Luther King established the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is hugely important. That's kind of the leaders, the educated, predominantly men, unfortunately, who were pastors, who were ordained ministers, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. A little bit later, I can go back. If you have more questions about the civil rights movement, there's a lot of things going on. I honestly, this is potentially an Alabama bias, but it's not one that is really, hey, this is the great thing about the state that I grew up in. The civil rights movement really was kind of centered in Alabama. The Montgomery Bus Boycott, the Birmingham riots and fire hoses and dogs, and then Selma, the march from Selma to Montgomery, all this happens in Alabama. Important things happen in Mississippi, North Carolina, Arkansas, but really Alabama is where the action is, which I think is one reason why it has impacted me so much. Is there anything in particular that you would like to know about the civil rights movement? Because the chronology from 1955 to 1965, I can kind of go into as much or as little detail as possible. I'll definitely tell you the end of this story, but let me just give you some kind of bullet points, and if you want me to, I can drill down further in them. So there's Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott that launches it. The next important part of the next important chapter in the story, in my opinion, are the students in Greensboro, North Carolina, who engaged in sit-ins, and why that matters. And they after that, once they got Woolworths desegregated, you couldn't order a hamburger and a milkshake you couldn't be black and order that at a Woolworths lunch counter. They got the rules of Woolworths changed. They didn't change any law necessarily. But what's important is you have the leaders at the top, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, kind of educated people who were experienced in leadership and older. The main thing is that they're older. And then the SNCC forms this group called SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So you kind of have the mind and the leadership and the vision, and then you've got the enthusiasm and the bodies of the students. So it's a wonderful partnership that ultimately falls apart when this whole thing, when the civil rights movement kind of ends. There's a question about when it does end, that kind of thing. I'll get to that in a second. But this kind of older generation, younger generation, and then later there's a split between them. What happens in Birmingham is monumentally important. I'm not just saying that because I'm from there, but here I think is the simplest way to just explain it. When Martin Luther King targeted Birmingham, Alabama, he called it Project C for confrontation. Like, we need a media event. He had experienced a failure prior to this time when demonstrators were just kind of quietly arrested and it sapped the protest of their energy. He lost that. That was in Albany, Georgia. The white sheriff of Albany, Georgia outsmarted him just by quietly, draining away the protesters and putting them in jails. So in Birmingham, he wanted a confrontation. He wanted something that would get the attention of the television, and it did. He chose Birmingham because the police chief there is named Bull Connor, who was a notorious racist, and he's not intelligent, and he's going to snap. And that's exactly what happened. And he snapped, and he's the one who ordered the fire hoses and the dogs. And so then those images went all around the world. Those images also impacted President Kennedy. Kennedy saw this. He was sickened by it. This is why the Cold War matters. Here he is, the standard bearer of democracy and capitalism, and this stuff is happening in his country. He's a liberal, Harvard-educated liberal, but he couldn't really do very much in the first 2 years of his presidency because he was elected with such a razor-thin majority in 1960 that doing something really kind of risky, he didn't quite have a political mandate. And everyone's afraid, all people are afraid of the midterm elections, what's going to happen. Once he did well, once the Democrats did well in the midterm election, he felt more emboldened to support the civil rights movement. So this is important because this is power. This is people in power giving their support to the people on the ground. Okay, and here's why I'm saying all of this as it relates to Birmingham. He saw this happening in Birmingham. He was sickened by it. And I'm sorry that I don't have the dates on this. I could check my notes, but it's not that important. And this movement in Birmingham was not like a day. It was not a weekend. This lasted for months. This was create a problem. Martin Luther King was arrested. That's why we have the letter from the Birmingham jail. He went to jail. Then he got out of jail, and the protests and all of that stuff were continuing. Again, this happened in the late spring and summer, and I believe into August and maybe September of 1963. There's an important phenomenon of action-reaction that starts because of Birmingham. John F. Kennedy goes on television, national television, everybody sees it at the exact same time. I'm the president of the United States. Excuse me. And on national television, he expresses support for the protesters. And what he says is, we are sending Americans to fight the Cold War. We're stationing them in Berlin. There was some station. Vietnam was just beginning. We have troops in Vietnam who are black and white. We cannot deny these black Americans their rights when they are fighting and sacrificing for America as a part of our effort to thwart and stand against communist totalitarianism. And so he says this on TV, exactly the way that I'm speaking right now. Everybody sees this. Black people, white people see this. Black people cheer because a white man in the White House is on their side. Racists are distraught, and they've lost. They do not have cover anymore. This is a very important phenomenon that is not unrelated to our present day in terms of, do the people on the ground have support from people in power? And what kind of support are they lending? What kind of tone are they setting? All right, here's everything that this is leading to. That same day, hours after President Kennedy said this on television, racists in Mississippi assassinated Medgar Evers, who was an African-American man who was the leader of the NAACP in the state of Mississippi. I mean, this man walked around with a target on his back, and then people shot at that target. But what was the impetus for that was losing the support of the president. So this is when the action-reaction, the ping pong starts. Then after that, in response to Medgar Evers' murder, they go ahead with the March on Washington, which occurred in August 1963. And that's when Martin Luther King delivers the "I Have a Dream" speech. In response to Martin Luther King and the unbelievable success of that March on Washington, again, racists bomb the 16th Street Church in Birmingham, Alabama, killing 4 little girls. One summer between my sophomore and junior year in college, I interned for the Birmingham Public Library, and it was my job that summer to catalog the FBI file on the 16th Street Church bombing. It was just unbelievable to read about this. So action, reaction going on in Birmingham, but it's really accelerating the pace and the tone of this. The Civil Rights Movement, there's a Civil Rights Act in 1964, which desegregated places of public accommodation. That means restaurants. So all of that stuff that you think of as segregation. Colored water fountains, colored bathrooms, segregated buses, segregated lunch counters, restaurants, all that stuff. That was basically done away with in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. What was not yet accomplished was voting rights, which came a year later in 1965 after Selma. So the famous march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where John Lewis, the recently deceased John Lewis, rest in peace, marched and was beaten to an inch of his life. that was in Selma, marching from Selma to Montgomery to try to get African Americans registered to vote in the state of Alabama. The violence of that day and the consequences of that led Lyndon Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act was ultimately passed after Selma as a result of Selma. Okay, so there's 1955 to 1965. That's kind of the civil rights movement in a nutshell, very simply there for you. A question that obviously lingers is, was that the end of the civil rights movement? Some people say the civil rights movement ended with the stroke of a pen when Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act in 1965. Obviously, things did not turn around instantly. And especially in the Black community, people can say the civil rights movement is going on today and it never really stopped. It just has kind of times of higher intensity and lower intensity. Let me say this, when the Voting Rights Act was signed, and this is an important transition to what happens after this. I'm sorry, they don't have the exact date. I believe it was August sometime 1965, but I do know this, less than a week later, less than 7 days later, were the riots in Watts, right here in Los Angeles. I'm going to talk about that transition in just a second because I believe it gets at a more nefarious form of racism. So I said this kind of earlier, again, not to minimize the power of legal structures at all, and how horrendous they can be on people. Suffering under unjust laws, but it's an easy target. Change the law. That law's bad. Change it. Mobilize, petition, write your congressman, et cetera, get the law changed. There are other forms of racism that are much more difficult to kind of identify and root out. I'll talk about that in just a second. And somewhat relatedly, Martin Luther King, who of course I admire like crazy, there's an interesting shift in him after 1965. He dies he's killed in 1968, and biographers of Martin Luther King and historians of the civil rights movement say he became angrier. He's definitely a Christian. He's definitely motivated by his faith. And in the kind of earlier part of the civil rights movement, beautiful sentence, we will outsuffer them. We will suffer more than them, not because we're gluttons for punishment, but just we know suffering's on its way and we have to endure more of it to get what we want. And we will, but we're not going to quit. And we shall overcome, and hope and organization. Then all those things that I was just describing about a certain form of racism being a bit more insidious and difficult to find and root out, Martin Luther King saw that. And he became a little bit less optimistic, and he became a little bit angrier, which I think is an important and an unfortunate part of the story. Okay, so again, less than a week after the Voting Rights Act is signed, there's the riot in Watts. Why was there a riot in Watts? It had to do with discriminatory policing. So this gets us to the topic of kind of more contemporary times, discriminatory policing. So again, there's photographs of signs that say white only and colored water fountain and these kinds of things that you can look at and denounce. There are pictures of fire hoses and dogs and cops beating people, which you can look at and denounce. The more kind of subtle oppression of people in this slow drip way is less easy to identify, but then you have these explosions of it. And these explosions often take the form of riots when certain communities, Black communities, whatever communities, have had enough. And with the Watts riot, it was based on discriminatory policing as well as discriminatory lending practices by banks. So this is where it's just difficult to you can say, okay, this segregation is wrong. Okay, and the laws need to be changed, and now the federal law has done that. It's a really different thing. Okay, a white man walks into a bank and says, I want a mortgage for my home. The bankers who most likely are a white, oh, hey, here comes another white guy. Okay, enter a black family. I'd like a mortgage for a house. We're going to look a little bit more carefully at your finances and your background and all that stuff. In addition to that, there was what was called redlining, which was basically segregating neighborhoods to prevent black people from moving into them. If you've ever heard the phrase, there goes the neighborhood, it's a very, I mean, you can use it in a non-racist way, but it's a really pretty, it's often, okay, the neighborhood's all white and everything's good, and then a black person moves in and there goes the neighborhood. Because crime is inevitably going to happen next, and property values are going to go down. And your American dream is lost as a result of that. Okay, we're up to about 1965 and the later 1960s. I'm going to speak a little bit more thematically next, but does anybody want to ask anything about the civil rights movement? Anything that you think I didn't cover? I just wanted to know a little bit more about. That's fine. Okay, so here's what's next. Really, I'm going to kind of fast forward a little bit to the present. And so I don't have very much to say about the 1970s. I think, again, kind of thematically, a documentary that helped me a lot to understand things that I was not aware of is the document. It's on Netflix. It's called 13th. The number 13th. And it's about the 13th Amendment, which was the amendment that freed the slaves. And there's a part of the amendment that says, I can't remember it verbatim, but people shall not be held in involuntary servitude except for cases of imprisonment. I think the documentary actually makes it infers or it implies a stronger connection that people did this then automatically shifted to incarcerating Black people rather than enslaving Black people. I don't think that it's that clear, that the line is that clear. But what you do have develop in the 80s, 90s, and into our present day is the prison industrial complex. And so in the 1980s, Just Say No and the war on drugs. Let me just give you an example of this regarding something that I have no personal knowledge of, cocaine. I like joking with students about cocaine because I feel like I can because I've never even seen cocaine. Cocaine is primarily a white person's party drug. Crack, when crack arrived, was primarily a Black person's whatever drug, I don't know. The punishments, the criminal sentences for cocaine and crack were vastly different. White people get a slap on the wrist, Black people go to jail for a very, very long time. I mean, and this is written into the laws. So this is the kind of thing that you can talk about when you talk about systemic racism. In addition to, so that's the war on drugs. So you can say drugs are bad and that there's a war on drugs, but this war on drugs was disproportionately felt by the Black community. All right, do you have any reefer on you? Okay, you're going to jail. You know, crack, you go to jail longer than the white guy who's been snorting coke. This is a systemic issue. Then in 1994, there was a 1994 crime bill. I'm not necessarily an expert on this, but this came out of Bill Clinton's tack to the right after he was criticized in 1993 and early 1994 for being too liberal. He kind of moved to the right. And one of the ways that he moved to the right was with this kind of aggressive crime bill, which white people saw as, okay, good, we're getting tough on Black folks. This created prisons, this created a legal system that would incarcerate people for not major crimes and simply lock a lot of Black people up, especially for something like marijuana, which now is legal. It's not legal in, I don't know how many states it's legal in, but it is now being legalized. And so many of these especially Black men, or rotting in jail because of possession, distribution, consumption, whatever of marijuana. So these laws are written, and these prisons are written to house them, to collect them, and that works hand in glove. The legal system and basically the business enterprise of these private prisons, that are very have their issues, for sure. That is being identified, and it's being attacked, and people are mobilizing for it to be dismantled in some form or fashion, especially now as marijuana is being legalized. But the war on drugs in the 1980s, the crime bill of 1994, are kind of biggies, kind of leading up to the present. Here's where I bump up, I run out of my expertise. And what we saw with George Floyd, I want to, I just want to say that there are long-term causalities for that, in terms of white folks feeling like they're the guards, and that have to control Black and brown people. I believe you actually saw this in Wisconsin with that 17-year-old kid running around with an assault rifle, and the police throwing him bottles of water, basically, keep up the good work, buddy. If it was a Black 17-year-old man running around with a gun, the police would not throw him bottles of water, and just assume, oh, you're protecting property and you're a good guy. That to me is probably the most damning indictment, and as well as evidence of a certain sense among some white people that they're the guards, that they protect law and order and property, and Black and brown people just go crazy and riot. Okay, let me say this about what I don't know, and then I'll try to say a little bit more about what I do know. There's an entire field called criminology. It's a subdiscipline of sociology. I am not a criminologist. I don't know criminology 101. I do absolutely think that police do their job of policing in a discriminatory way. Maybe not every police officer is a racist. Not every police officer wants to pull a trigger on somebody, but there's something there. And I'm going to, I hope I'm not begging off of this. I don't want to speak when I don't know fully what I'm talking about, and I'm not a criminologist. So I don't have the tools to kind of describe and explain what's going on there, but something's definitely going on there. And what I'm interested in the kind of a weird psychological way, is what is in these police officers' minds in the seconds before they pull the trigger. I think that honestly, that is important psychological information to get. To try to understand what's going on there. So I'm sorry that I don't have more to say about that. We have about 15 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is conclude by talking about the last 10 or 15 years and the unbelievable kind of breakneck speed of change that we've been experiencing, and why this is coming up again when it is. And for this narrative, I would start it in approximately 2007. So let's just, if we took 2007 as a baseline, like things are kind of as they are in 2007. An image that I like to use is a bunch of streams converging into a raging river. So the streams are separate from one another, but then when they combine, you have a real torrent. And the streams of change, basically what I'm talking about is change. And so I'm getting a little bit away from race, although race plays a major role in this. If we could go back in a time machine and it's 2007, the world actually looks kind of different from today. I mean, minus, it clearly didn't have coronavirus. The iPhone had not yet come out. Social media existed, but was not as dominant, not as kind of kaka-cuckoo. So in 2007, the iPhone came out. I think that is a major, literally historic change in terms of putting cameras and computers in people's hands. Then in 2008 was the financial crisis. Before coronavirus, I said to students, and I believe this 100%, that the most important historical event since World War II was the financial crisis, because it just completely upended capitalism. And people didn't really understand it. We still don't have a clean narrative about it. The analogy that I used is, think of a snow globe, and you take a snow globe and you can just, flip it up and then turn it back, and then the snow kind of gently falls. Now think of, and it's, usually a village scene, and then the snow drifts down on the village. Think of doing that, but not just the snow, but all of the buildings themselves become unmoored from their foundations and float up into the air along with the snow, and then are slowly drifting back into some new form that doesn't look exactly the way that it looked before. That twist, that motion there, and that turning the world upside down and then letting everything resettle, that I believe is what the financial crisis did. So that is a major stream that contributes to these changes. And people still do not understand fully the impact of the financial crisis. I think it caused people to run into their tribes. It caused all kinds of economic hardship and uncertainty and fear. And it was not easy to explain. That led definitely to the election of Barack Obama, who was considered to be better with the economy than John McCain. So we have our first Black president, and everyone is happy. Even a lot of Republicans are thrilled about this. And so we have a Black man as president. I truly believe that was mind-blowing for people who had never seen a Black man in authority. To see a Black person in power, I believe, was psychologically shocking to a lot of people, especially baby boomers who had never seen that. No offense to the baby boomers watching this, listening to it. But I think that was a major, another one of these streams. Okay, here is in a way where this class ends, and it honestly ends on a note of hope and a note of the power of Christian faith, and I'm not kidding about that. So Barack Obama ran, and his campaign slogan was change. Some people embrace that and love it. Other people can't stand it and fear it. A lot of things did change. In this one weekend, this literally, I can't remember the exact dates. It might have been May or June 2015. It actually might have been a little bit later than that. Sorry. Let me get back to that weekend in just a second. Sometime in the summer of 2015, a young man named Dylan, I can't remember his last name, and I don't want to remember his last name, shot up the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I don't know if y'all remember that or not. He went in and participated in a white guy participating in this Bible study in this predominantly African-American church, gained their trust, and however many days or weeks later, he then pulled out an automatic weapon and killed I don't know how many people. President Obama went down there for the memorial services and mourning. That was, and what he said when he was interrogated by the police is, "I wanted to start a race war." That's what he said. He wanted to engage. He wanted to be the first shots of in a race war, provocatively killing Black people in this famous church in the hopes that Black people would retaliate, and then you have a race war. Here is, in my opinion, here is the power of Christian faith. The members of that church, maybe not all of them, they forgave him. They stopped 400 years of violence and hatred and death with the power of Christian love. An entire freight train, and not only a freight train that has momentum behind it, but a freight train that has an intended destination of trying to launch a race war. I am unbelievably humbled and just pure admiration of these people's faith. And so I want to point that out. I think that that's important. I would say this in any context, but because this is a church event, I think it deserves kind of special attention and special absolute admiration. That was in the early summer of 2015. Later in the summer of 2015, in response to this, the governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, took down the Confederate flag over South Carolina. And so what I was saying about Birmingham in terms of action reaction, I think that those murders, as well as what happened in Ferguson, Missouri in earlier 2014, that these are actions by racists that then have launched, that then have started this kind of ping pong of action reaction. Action by racists, response by the Black community, accelerated action by other racists. And the thing that really made me, when my wife told me that this had happened in this church, my heart and my stomach just sank. And then when, like the other thing that really made me just sad and nervous for the future is there was some altercation. A white South Carolinian was all upset about the flag coming down. And he said something about, I don't care if I go to jail, it's not as important as the Southern blood that runs through my veins. And why that was a strong sense of identity. And a strong sense of identity, which is defined by opposition and a certain, again, I try to use this carefully, but a certain racism. And when I saw that embracing of that, but it was, again, it's the third iteration of the action reaction. There's the action of the shooting, there was the reaction of the lowering the flag, and then there was the reaction to that of a certain renewed sense of Southern nationalism and racism. That worried me. That worried me a great bit. I'm going to not get political in this class. I do think the main thing that I think leaders do is set the tone for what is permissible and what's not permissible. And I absolutely think that the tone that is being set now does provide not only space, but cover and potentially encouragement to people who believe and want to push America in the direction of being a white country for white people only. In 2017, we saw Charlottesville. In 2019, we saw George Floyd, and that kind of brings it up to the present. I am still hopeful. I'm actually very hopeful that I'm honestly encouraged by the response to, I'm encouraged by the response to George Floyd's death. I'm horrified by the death itself, but I was amazed at the reaction to it. I don't have a grand finale. I hope that I just wanted to kind of bring it up to the present. I do have a question that I'd like to ask everybody, though, related to kind of what comes next. And but does anybody want to ask any question? Again, I have a little bit more to say about kind of what happens next and how we think about this both individually and as a church. But does anybody want to ask any question about the history?
One thing I noticed, Stewart, is that most of what you've discussed is in the South.
Mm-hmm.
And as a Northerner, it is actually a protective place to be to think it's a Southern problem. Mm-hmm. You hinted at talking about the California issues without getting there too much. It was too much to do in 4 hours, I think. But also, I guess I was struck both at sort of the history of problems in Minnesota, and one of the things, there was you as a researcher get access to Google searches and do studies with them. And one of the the searches for the N-word while Obama was giving his acceptance speech really, really spiked, and in various iterations. And apparently that was the places where that happened was a strong predictor of Trump's win. And it was way more to the north than implied, than one would think. And I guess, have you thought much, or have you really focused on the issues in the South, or thought about how this plays out in the rest of the country?
I have a little bit, and the unfortunate formula is all you need to have ethnic violence are two different ethnicities. And all you need to have racial violence are two different races. So, and so when blacks left the South and went to places like Los Angeles and Chicago, as soon as they got there, they were not welcomed with open arms. Each state is different. In Oregon, we went to Oregon a couple summers ago. I believe it was honestly in the state constitution of Oregon it lasted from 1859 until 1929 that it was illegal to be black in Oregon. The state was officially legally closed to black people. So this is, I mean, thank you for saying that, because this is an American problem. So you have the Watts Riot in 1965. Another great documentary that I could not recommend more highly is called LA 92. If you want to see this in our city, watch the documentary LA 92. It's on Netflix. It's phenomenal. There are really, really good documentarians out there. It tells the story from both sides, from all different sides, side of the police, the side of the black community, side of the white community. Definitely, points out the injustice of it, and doesn't hem-haw about that. But just the camera people are with all of these different communities. It's really good. So anyway, my point is, this is an American problem. It just doesn't. And when Martin Luther King was killed in 1968, there were riots in pretty much every major city across the country. So, and what that has to do with is the racial discrimination of wanting to keep blacks out of people's neighborhoods. Make sure that there's a long history of making sure black men don't date your daughter. All this stuff, and that is not just Southern. I could actually talk about kind of broader stuff in the world, like what happened to the Aboriginal people in Australia. I'm actually really interested to know more about that story. I know almost nothing about it, but the effects on the Black community of Australia is almost identical. Mass incarceration, suspicions of criminality, discriminatory policing, all the same stuff that affects America. We're after 8, and so I want to be respectful of your time. I'd actually like to ask y'all a couple questions, if I may.
Can I just add something based on what Lucy said? Yeah. So I don't know how many of y'all lived through the LA riots. I lived through the LA riots at the LA Times in downtown, where, yeah, I had to carry a gun in my car to not be carjacked and wear a bulletproof vest and a bunch of things. So, I mean, and now I live in Alabama, so I feel like I can represent a little bit. I really, honestly, like, all my friends are like, how can you live in Alabama? It's so terrible. I'm like, I don't see any more racism here than I did there. Yeah. I really don't. But I worked in inner city high schools, and I did a lot of things that maybe made me see a lot of things you don't see in South Pass, where everybody's, you know, friends. But I don't know, just I may have a different perspective, but I actually don't see it. I'm with Lucy. I don't see it as a Southern problem, although certainly I see the South as the cradle of most American problems. I don't see it as any more racist.
Yeah, no, I've witnessed the most kind of racist things I've witnessed actually happened outside of the South. These really ugly incidents. That might mean the ones that happen in the South are kind of even more nefarious because they're kind of hidden and sly about it. But yeah, anyway, just to continue the point that this is an American problem.
Stewart, I have a question.
Yeah, yeah.
I just finished reading a book, and they talked about Blacks during World War II. And just like you said, you know, they were not equal as far as the military was concerned, but they suffered and died like the white people. But my question is, I want to know how historically accurate this was, because they said over in England, where these men were, the Blacks were much more accepted, not even nearly as denigrated as they were here. Yeah. Is that historically correct?
I believe it is, and I don't want to take anything away from that. Like a later example, in the 1960s, Jimi Hendrix, this great guitarist, went from the United States to Britain, and in Britain, that's where people really loved him, and he really kind of blossomed in England because it was a less racist society than America was. Yeah. Just to like put a little bit of a qualifier on that, there's a kind of, I think a little bit in Britain, there's a kind of, oh, wow, people of color, that's so novel. And unfortunately, an unfortunate reality about racism is when there's economic competition. Okay, it's one thing to come and visit. Like, hey, we're Black people visiting. We're soldiers. We're going to go back home when the war's over, or I'm a guitarist and I'm going to go back home when my gig's over or whatever. But okay, we're here and we're here to live. Now you have to we're gonna have to make room for us in the neighborhood and make room for us culturally. That's when things get rougher. And so like the English have not always treated people from Pakistan, very well. And there was a labor shortage after World War II, and a bunch of Jamaicans came to live in, were taken to, the project had some names like the Nightingale or something like that. But they were brought in to help rebuild England after the war. They were not necessarily welcomed with open arms.
I was just curious because they did actually talk about the shock value of seeing Black people over there after the war. So yeah. I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
No, thank you. I'd also like to mention real fast, I'm so glad you're recording this. I wasn't able to make it to the last 2 classes, but I was able to watch it on YouTube. Good. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I know another thing that has been discussed a little more in the media lately, I think because of Glendale, is the reality of sundown towns.
Yeah.
In California. And if you really want to
South Pass was one of them.
What? Yeah, South Pass
I
think was a sundown town, like a lot of them along Route 66. Does everyone know what I'm talking about? I have not read, there's a book that was reprinted in 2018, and there was a sociologist that did work on sundown towns. As basically people of color were not allowed in town after sundown. So let alone living in town. And that was a reality. South Pass was one. Glendale, I think their city council voted on a resolution
to apologize
in the past, I think the past month. So it's
that actually might be something to think about. We could petition the South Pass to do the same. Yeah. It's funny. I just I got an email about a book that was just released, so they're promoting it, and it was about Jim Crow and segregation in California in the West. And there's this great quote from someone there. This really encapsulates it. An African-American woman said, the only difference between, and they literally said this town, the only difference between Pasadena and Mississippi is how they're spelled.
Well, I think the South is older, and you have all these monuments and you have all these things from that time. And you go to California, everything's new.
Yeah.
So you don't have all that stuff to look at and say, ooh, that's terrible. That's this. Because the place where the Zoot Suit riots were and stuff like that doesn't show anymore. That's all gone. There's not any tangible thing to look at and say, that's where that happened.
And Pasadena had this, a lot of places did, but Pasadena had this thing about swimming pools, segregated swimming pools. I don't know, it's just always, maybe it's because people are wearing bathing suits and they're in proximity to one another and stuff like that. There's this just almost pathological, this bizarre concern about interracial sex. This is actually, I should have said this, probably in last class, where segregation came from. This is fascinating to me. And believe it or not, segregation originated in the North. Then it would kind of, when the South got bought onto it real fast. But segregation actually started in trains, because a train has all these separate cabs. So you can very easily designate, this is the white cab, this is the black cab, this is the dining cab, this is the sleeping cab, whatever. But they segregated them because of overnight trips. And they were absolutely terrified that Black people and white people would be sleeping in the same space. And so then you have to very carefully demarcate what those spaces, what's the white space, what's the Black space.
I will say though, as much as I defend Alabama, I was driving through a rural area, and my daughter, who's lived here longer and went to the university, said, well, we're in an all-white county. And I was like, what are you even talking about? And she's like, well, this was a white county, Bibb County. You could not be Black here. I was like, well, what are you talking about? She's like, well, they would just run you off. So it's like, I don't know. I still continue to be surprised, but when I used to drive from LA into South Pass, there was like an invisible wall between LA and South Pass. So I don't know that, again, I can see it as the same.
Yeah, there's a county in northern Alabama called Winston County. That Winston County, when Alabama seceded from America in the Civil War, Winston County seceded from Alabama. Like, fine, be a part of the Confederacy. We're going to be this little island of Unionists. But what's interesting about it, it's in northern Alabama where there are mountains. This is where geography plays this important role. So they're not plantation. You can't have plantations where there are mountains, and so there weren't Black people. And so these were all white people, but they're hillbillies. It's more hillbilly-like than kind of redneck. But these hillbillies didn't want to be a part of the Confederacy, which is interesting. But they also, Winston County then later became basically a sunset county. And there's a sign, and I think it used the N-word, in this big sign on these roads going into Winston County, N-word, don't let the sun set on your back in Winston County. Big fat warning, don't come in here. Again, I want to be respectful of people's time, and I have a question, just one or two questions I'd like to ask y'all, but I don't want to take up the time with my own questions if you have other questions.
I'd like to hear yours.
Okay. My question is, it's the same question with two parts, kind of what to do next. And you don't have to have an answer right away, but just something, this is what I love about a church body. You know, this is not, hey, I'm just speaking to a auditorium and then I go home and we never see each other again. You know, we're part of this church community. So if you would like other classes, you know, more in depth, shorter, you know, 2 weeks, 1 week, you know, little kind of hits here and there or follow-ups, I'll gladly do that. There's also the possibility of activism, which I'm not trained in, but like I would really like to express it this way. The theologian and basically the Christian who's alive now that I admire most is a man named N.T. Wright. He was a bishop and he's an Episcopalian. I think supposedly he did the Queen Mum's funeral. So he's well connected. And he's a brilliant theologian and writer. And he basically can reduce the church's task to this beautiful 10-word sentence that honestly is a mantra for me, which is be at the place where the world is in pain. Be at the place where the world is in pain. This is a place where the world is in pain. For the church to be the church, we can simply be at that place and think about what we can do. And this class doesn't end with, here, sign this petition or go and do these 5 things. I did say in the syllabus to listen to one another. And what I mean by that is listen to the stories and the experiences of people of color and how they've experienced life differently. Let me just share this one thing quickly with you. My wife is Filipino, person of color. I don't know what all discrimination she's experienced, but not the discrimination that a Black person would experience. We were married for 10 years before she said to me, I mean, she wasn't holding this back or anything, but just kind of, we definitely talked about race and racial differences and stuff before when we were courting and all these kind of things. Like, I'm a white guy from the South, you know, and, you know, how's this going to go? But it was 10 years into our marriage before she said, have you ever wanted to be a different race? And that was just incredibly sad to me, that at certain parts of her childhood, as a minority, as a racial minority, you know, even in LA, she grew up in LA, she internalized that and wanted to not be herself. That's incredibly sad to me. And then just this past summer, she told me this is more, that one's a biggie. That's really big in my opinion. And just to think, and the answer is no, I've never thought about being a different race. I said in the last class that I think comedians are really hitting the nail on the head with a lot of stuff. This comedian is now disgraced, unfortunately, because of gross stuff he did, but that still doesn't mean his insights are not insightful. His name's Louis C.K. and he had this kind of funny bit about, like, what if you could sign up for your race like you renew your driver's license? And he, you know, he's a comedian, he's joking about it, and he says, what race do I want to be, you know, for the next year? Oh, white. Definitely. It's working out very well for me. You know, I'm just like, if there were that option to choose, yeah, guess he's a white guy, life's going pretty good for him, he's not experiencing discrimination. It's just, I thought that was a good comedic way of putting it. But when my wife told me that, it really opened my eyes to an experience that I'd never had that was very, very sad. The thing she said to me last summer was kind of more smaller potatoes. When we were first dating, she went on a cruise with her family, and we had just started dating, and she was worried that she intentionally did not tan herself, sit out in the sun on a cruise. You know, I was like, well, that's what you do on a cruise. Because she was afraid that when she got back that she would be so dark that I might not like her. I mean, I definitely asked her, I said, God, did I say anything or do anything that made you you know, that made you think I like lighter skin more than dark skin or something? And she said, no, it was just from her childhood issues. But it really, you know, I think about this a lot. I read a lot of books about it. This was very sad to me. Okay, so these, so one question is, what can we do as a church? And we don't have to answer that now. We're in community with one another. We're in conversation with one another that can develop further. The other question that I have is, I feel called to talk about this stuff. And in the Episcopal Church, there's this discernment process. I'm not asking for an official discernment committee and to take up a bunch of people's time, but I'm interested in having more conversations about this. This is going to be an area of research for me, I think, for the second half of my career. So in other words, the rest of my life, I'm going to talk about race and trauma and memory and identity within an American context. But the discernment so I feel called to that. Exactly what that looks like, I don't know. In the same way that when people say, I feel called to the ministry, and then a discernment committee kind of comes around that person and helps that person figure it out. I'm not asking for you to sacrifice a tremendous amount of your time or something, but there are blind spots that I don't have. There are ways forward that I don't know. There are blind spots that I do have, excuse me. There are blind spots that I don't have also. So I want to help in this. I really do. There's some interesting things going on at Pepperdine right now that to be involved with. But I'd also would like to speak to our city, to this wonderful city that we live in. And I'm trying to develop a voice in this conversation. And I said this to Dana in an email. I want off the bench. Like, there's a really important conversation going on, and I want in the game. But I don't want to fall into the trap of being the white savior. Definitely not interested in that. But I do want to contribute in some form or fashion. So if y'all as a community have any suggestions, any ways forward, just little, again, not asking for you to put a tremendous amount of time or energy into this, but I just really appreciate that as I kind of discern how I can contribute to this conversation.
What is your email address?
Stewart Davenport at Pepperdine
edu. Thank you.
You know, Stewart, one thing that this is an ongoing conversation, right? My first thought, and leave you this to think about it as you go forward, is, you know, you can contribute at the place where you're unique. You know, what is it that you can bring to the conversation? And I will say that, you know, some of the stuff you said about how, you know, 17th, 18th century poor whites coming out of indentured servitude found, you know, were given a way to have status over the enslaved people, and how that continued through history into policing ideas. That to me was one of these, like, oh, right. You know, and you can sort of see, and that especially with the issue of it being discriminatory policing, it's not necessarily that those are the only people who have those ideas. It's rather a place where it gets, this implicit cultural approach gets expressed. But just as you think about it, what you're bringing to the conversation is a historian. And I think those places, you know, when they look at how you get people to change their minds, we don't like being wrong, and changing our mind is an acknowledgement that we were wrong. So we don't like to do it. And people can find their way towards it when they have a reason for things being different. New information. Oh, I didn't understand this before. I think one of the things that's happened with the cameras, you can't look away anymore. Oh, now I see that. Now I've got to change what I'm doing. But I would just suggest try to reflect on what is the historian's perspective that can help others find a way to change their minds, find a way to not have to say I was wrong while shifting to something new.
I really like that in terms of, because it relates to what I said last week about it's not just a matter of telling the story. I mean, I can bring the historian's story to the conversation, but ladling out hate, ladling out paranoia. There was something you said in there, I think you said about how it's eye-opening. And that's not just a matter of the story. It's why I think the kind of
you made. It's being able to see not just the story from the past, but the connection to the present.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a major fault line in our society right now that is heavily, it tracks exactly with our politics, or our politics track exactly with that, is what is the story that you tell of America? There's a version of the story which is very flag waving, and all these white guys storming the beaches of Normandy or crossing the Delaware or sending a man to the moon. That's all the accomplishments of white people, but I'm proud of those accomplishments. Those are accomplishments of the United States of America. But people have a difficult time re-envisioning a multicultural America, where the same things of sending people to the moon or winning wars or whatever can be done by what America really looks like, and not only one slice of the American demographic. But that involves a kind of a reconceptualization of the story. And when people get really, really patriotic, they're buying into a single story that validates them. Another comedian who I think nailed it. This is a kind of controversial thing for me to say here, because it's just a little controversial. But there's a comedian who said it. I'm gonna quote him, and I think he has a good thing to say. His name's Daniel Tosh. That's the comedian I'm quoting. He said, rednecks are proud Americans because they have literally nothing else to be proud of. That's harsh. That's why it's controversial. Like, I can't say that in a room full of rednecks. But there is a sociological truth to that. I'm interested in rednecks being themselves and being fully patriotic Americans, just more understanding of non-white peoples and the importance of their inclusion, and the importance of the fact of the inclusion of those communities in the American story. Anyway, I want to retell that story, and I want to try to convince people that it's not just the American story is not just a white story, and white kind of triumphalism and accomplished, and people of color just being the laborers. The story needs to change, because that's an inaccurate representation.
I just think it's important we stop blaming the victims of poverty and of generations of inequality, and we have to acknowledge at some point that the playing field isn't level at the start. I mean, until people are willing to acknowledge that, I just don't know how anything changes. If we're really going to believe a myth that everyone has an opportunity in this country, they do to some extent, but they don't really have the same shot. And until we give every child the same shot, but it just doesn't exist. I mean, you look at the research on different zip codes and how likely someone is to leave poverty in certain zip codes. It's not at all equitable.
Yeah.
So, I mean, really, until you're gonna, I agree, changing the story and having a deep understanding of the why is really important. But I think we have to look at, like, what do we need to do right now to change it for young people who are alive right now, so that they actually have a chance to live differently.
I'm actually optimistic about this as well. The opinions about LGBT issues changed real fast. I mean, there's a lot of momentum behind that. And then there's this kind of amazing 10-year period from about 2005 to 2015 when just everything changed. People changed their mind. There's a term I don't know if I'm cool enough to use, being woke, but I like it because it means being awake. Just all right, you got your eyes open. I used an analogy earlier, which is connecting dots. That's what I'm interested in doing, is people seeing the present and understanding the long story that led up to what it is they're looking at in real time. Excuse me.
Did you hear about Pope Francis? What he did? Yeah.
Yeah, I know that. And a point that I don't know if I completely finished is when I was talking about 2007 and these streams kind of converging into a river. One of the things that I think is going on right now, this is not a political statement, but there's just so much change and a lot of people just can't take it. And I don't know if I'm sympathetic to that, but I do understand it. That you have gay marriage, you have social media, you have healthcare changing, you have people, and then it gets very intimate. Like there are going to be trans people in the bathroom with your children, and like, oh, what's that going to mean? And so just all of these changes happening so fast. People want to put the brakes on. And that's something that I think has defined the politics of the last 4 years is, forget all this change. We want to get in a time machine and go back to 1980. Because this change is unpleasant for us. Okay, I've gone for about an hour, or it's 8:30 now, so I very much want to be respectful of your time. I've enjoyed this tremendously. The main thing I want to say is if there's any way that I can help on this issue, I want to help. So if you can think of places where it'd be good for me to speak, ways it'd be good for me to write on this, I'm all ears. I want to, like I said, I want to join into this conversation in some way. Thank you.
Thank you, Stewart, for your time and just for all that you've shared with us.
Oh, you are more than welcome.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely.
Learned a
all
lot.
Right. See y'all. See you sometime soon.
Yes.
All right. Take care.
Right.
Bye. Go Dodgers.
Yeah.